Hello audience. In this video we pretty much finish reassembling the truck. So I'm making a few improvements on the front of the engine. You may remember it had some weird apparatus for the crankcase breather. Well, I bought an actual breather cap for it. And no one ever installed a seal for the cam, and this was leaking pretty bad, so I bought one. It had an original pulley on it, but it's pretty loose on the crankshaft, as they normally are. So I got a new billet aluminum pulley with an adjustable side on it. That's going to fix all that. Although I think this I'm going to paint it first, so it looks a little less obvious. At this point I'd like to point out that I'm going to be changing a few things on the electrical system on this truck. Now you may remember before, it didn't really have an electrical system. I had a car battery sitting in the back that was powering the ignition system and the lights, and it had no charging system, and that pretty much worked. You could get enough out of a car battery to power it for a few days, especially if you're not driving at night, but that was kind of a temporary thing and I didn't want to leave it that way. So what I'm going to do is, since it already has a newer engine in it, I have a rebuilt stock Model T generator. It's ready to go. I don't really have any use for it. It's been sitting around longer than I've even owned the truck. So I'm going to bolt this on and get a 6-volt car battery for it. And since it'll already have a battery and a charging system, I'm also going to add an electric starter. Now this is an original that's not been rebuilt. In fact, it's in pretty bad shape. I kind of patched it together and I think it'll work. So electrically, this is going to be like a stock 1919 or newer electric starter equipped Model T. And obviously because of time, I'm probably just going to throw all this together and we'll get more into detail about it probably in future videos. Because it has a generator now, we need to install an ammeter somewhere, and the controls that were on it weren't really set up all that good to begin with, so I'm setting up a different set of controls for it. This is a dash panel off a 1919 to 1922-ish starter-equipped car. Originally, it would have an instrument panel here that had the ammeter, the light switch, the ignition switch, and it even has a place for the choke rod. Now, I don't have the proper instrument panel for this, and I'm not going to overbid for one on eBay just to get this running, so I made my own, which I did race car style. It's a piece of stainless steel with a reproduction Model A ammeter and some hardware store switches. One for the ignition, one for the lights. Now the way I wired it up is somewhat different. Now the charging system is pretty standard. The wires from the battery and the generator go to the ammeter, and power comes from that for the ignition and the lights. Now for the ignition system, before I was powering it with a 12-volt battery, and now it's going to have a 6-volt battery, so there's going to be a slight loss in power, which I didn't want. So I got this inverter to crank it back up to 12 volts. Now this is just to power the ignition system. I've also added a 30 amp circuit breaker, which is just for the lights, just to make things a little more safe. Now if you're not familiar with the Model T ignition system, and even if you are, it can get pretty confusing really quickly. Now generally with a distributor type ignition system, putting more voltage into it doesn't give it more power. Generally, it's either 6 volts or it's 12 volts. Neither system really has a performance advantage over the other, you just set it up for whatever power source the car has. Generally, with those, you do not want to run a 6-volt coil on 12 volts, and you do not want to run a 12-volt coil on 6 volts. It'll still run, but you can have weird tuning problems that no one can figure out. I've run into that a few times with different cars. Now with the Model T ignition system, we need to completely forget those rules, because the Model T coil was originally designed to run on magneto, which the voltage output on that can be anywhere from 5 volts at idle to over 30 volts at high speed, and the coil is just made to work with that. The higher the voltage that goes into it, the more power and more efficiency you get. So as a general rule, the more voltage you can put to the ignition system, the more power you'll have, and they'll just take it. And if that's not confusing enough, the magneto also puts out alternating current, so roughly maybe half of the time these are firing backwards, which for a distributor ignition system, you don't want that. If it's wired up backwards, it's not going to work properly or as good as it should, but these work just fine either way. Why that is, I have no idea, but it just does. I've read a few tech articles over the years, and some people recommend that if you're not going to run the magneto, the next best thing is to power the ignition with 12 volts, because, like I said, more voltage, more power, and that's not going to overload these because they're made for a way higher voltage than that. Now some of you may be wondering, it already had a 12-volt battery on it, why don't I just leave it all 12 volts instead of essentially converting it to 6 volts and then stepping the voltage back up to 12 for the ignition system? Well, mostly because now it has a charging system and a starter. Now, the Model Ts, they're not very easy to set up for 12 volts, not like the Model As. There's not really a standard way of doing it. As you've seen, the generator is gear driven, so you can't just get an old Delcotron, make some brackets, and hang it on the side of the engine like you can most other cars. You either need to convert it to being belt driven, which means you need a V-groove pulley, and there's not really that many locations on the engine where you can hang a generator on. Or you can get a custom-made alternator that's been made to be gear-driven to go in place where the generator was. The problem with that is it's not an OEM part, it's a conversion, so I don't know how they've done it or what quality level it's done at, and all of that costs money and work. The starter is another big problem, because the stock Model T starter does not want to work on 12 volts. They're very light duty. If you zap them with 12 volts, they start breaking parts. Now you can fix that by adding a resistor to it somewhere. Some people rewire them for 12 volts. In recent years, that problem has kind of been fixed because you can now buy a brand new 12 volt starter that bolts right on. However, that does cost money. Now on the other hand, I have a stock generator, a stock starter. If I run all that on 6 volts like it was originally intended to, it'll work just fine and it'll stay working. So to me, that makes more sense. Alright, it's a few more days later and it's pretty much done now. So here's a few extra things that I did. Obviously, I had to get a battery. Now, on the big trucks, in later years when the starter became an option, this is where they located them, between the frame and the running board, and I decided that was a pretty good location. It's pretty much out of the way of everything. Now, this is a homemade tray that I made to hold it. I don't have an original, and that wouldn't do much good anyway because this battery is not to the dimensions of an original. It's got the cables routed up pretty normal. I'm using a regular original Model T starter switch. You might notice this skinny cable coming out of it. This is 4 gauge, which on these you really shouldn't use anything smaller than a 2 gauge, but I couldn't find a 2 gauge one that would work for this. However, in spite of that, and in spite of the starter falling apart, it still kind of works. Yeah, good enough. On the transmission, I've got the proper clutch pedal on it like it should have. I left the 2627 brake pedal because it's already been modified for the brake system on this, although I might fix that eventually, I don't know. I made a block-off plate for where the magneto post would go. Then for the firewall, obviously the wiring for the charging system is all new. I got a proper Model T terminal block and wiring it up pretty much like they did originally. It's the generator and the battery. This one was for the magneto originally, which I'm not running, so I'm using it as a ground terminal for all the components under the dash that need grounding. And that's about it. I have the choke somewhat hooked up so it works from inside the car. Good enough. Now just for fun, I wrapped the exhaust in heat insulation, which I don't know if it's going to do any good, but it can't hurt. So the next thing we're going to do is fire it up and see what happens. Well, it starts and runs, and it didn't take much trouble to do so that's good. It's not quite ready to drive on the street just yet. The bands are still way out of adjustment, and there's a bunch of new oil leaks I need to sort out, but the worst part is over anyway. So I just need to make a few more adjustments and then it'll be back on the road, which you will see in a future video. Maybe even the next video, we'll see. But anyway, that's it for now. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.